The world outside the cockpit of the Times, Kansas Queen Times, was a hell of fire and smoke. A black cloud erupted just off the right wing, and the entire 200,000-pound bomber shuddered violently, a sound of tearing metal screaming through the fuselage. The co-pilot yelled, his voice tight with panic. "We're hit! Flak! Right wing! It's coming apart!" But through the chaos, the pilot, Lieutenant Davies, held the yoke steady, his eyes locked on the shredded wing. He saw the aluminum skin peeled back like a tin can, but something impossible was happening. The main spar, the very bone of the aircraft, was holding. One single, solitary point of connection was refusing to give way, a stubborn anchor in a storm of destruction. That single point was a secret, a mistake, a piece of a Kansas farm buried in the heart of a war machine, and it was the only thing keeping them in the sky. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The memory came to him not in a flash, but as a slow, warm sunrise, a stark contrast to the perpetual damp grey of the English airbase. It was a sun-baked, wind-swept afternoon on his family's farm in rural Kansas, sometime back in the 1930s. The air, thick with the scent of freshly cut hay, and the rich, dark smell of turned soil, carried a third aroma, the one Earl Haskins loved most, the sharp, metallic tang of grease and hot steel from his father's workshop. He could almost feel it now, standing in the mud of East Anglia, the phantom weight of a heavy, coarse, threaded steel bolt in his young hand. He remembered the sound of his father's voice, patient and low, a rumbling cadence that seemed to vibrate with the same steady power as the tractors he so expertly mended. They were working on the big barn door, the one that faced west and took the full force of the prairie thunderstorms. The upper hinge pin, a piece of factory, specified steel, had sheared clean off during the last big blow, leaving the massive wooden door hanging at a drunken, dangerous angle. A teenaged Earl had watched his father examine the break, his brow furrowed in thought. He had the replacement part, a shiny new pin, identical to the one that had failed, resting on the workbench. His father picked it up, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, and then tossed it aside with a soft clatter. He turned instead to an old coffee can, a treasure chest filled with a chaotic assortment of nuts, washers, and screws scavenged over decades. His large, calloused fingers rummaged through the collection before emerging with a thick, oversized bolt, its dark gray steel finish dull and unpretentious. "See this, son?" his father had said, holding the bolt up. It was ridiculously large for the hinge. "The manual says use a light pin, but that manual was written by a fella who never saw a Kansas thunderstorm. It was written by someone who thinks the world works on paper just like it does out here in the dirt. Sometimes you need something with more backbone than brains, something that'll hold when everything else wants to let go." Earl had watched, fascinated, as his father drilled out the hinge hole, widening it to accept the formidable new piece of hardware. The bolt slid into place with a satisfying, solid thud. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't correct, but as his father tightened the nut, Earl could see the entire frame of the door pull itself straight, settling into a new, unshakable alignment. The lesson settled deep in his bones, a fundamental truth that felt more real than any textbook diagram. It was a respect for practical, durable solutions over theoretical, by the book ones. When they finished, his father had tossed him one of the leftover steel bolts. Earl had slipped it into his pocket, and it had been there, a cold, heavy good luck charm, ever since. That world of sun, soil, and practical fixes felt a universe away from the bustling, muddy Army Air Forces base in eastern England in the year 1944. Here, the constant, deafening drone of B-24 Liberators was the only weather, a perpetual storm of internal combustion that vibrated in your teeth and rattled your soul. The sky was a lid of damp, oppressive grey, and the air tasted of high-octane aviation fuel, wet earth, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. Dozens of the massive bombers, olive drab and menacing, sat in long, silent rows on the tarmac, their tails painted with the emblems of hope and defiance. Ground crews, like ants swarming over sleeping giants, moved with an organized chaos, their movements sharp and efficient in the cold air. Corporal Earl Haskins, now in his early 20s, moved among them. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so, an observant shadow in greasy overalls. His hands, no matter how hard he scrubbed, were never truly clean, the lines in his palms permanently etched with the grime of engines and airframes. He had a reputation as a gifted mechanic, a man with an almost supernatural, intuitive understanding of the complex machines he tended. He could diagnose a rough, running engine by its cough, feel a structural weakness through the soles of his boots. But he was not a fan of military bureaucracy. He saw the endless paperwork, the triplicate forms, the rigid adherence to regulations as a frustrating obstacle to the real job, keeping the birds flying. His direct superior, Sergeant Wallace, was the living embodiment of that bureaucracy. Wallace was a man who lived, breathed, and slept by the regulations. His uniform was always sharp, his shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the ever-present mud. He viewed the magnificent bee, 24 seconds, not as living, breathing machines, but as inventory, assets governed by a holy trinity of manuals, directives, and supply chain logistics. To Wallace, Earl's farm, bred intuition wasn't a gift. It was a dangerous liability, a rogue variable in an equation that demanded absolute conformity. The tension between the two men was a low hum beneath the roar of the engines, a reflection of the larger conflict gripping the squadron. They were flying daily missions deep into the heart of Germany, and the fleet was taking a savage beating. The bombers would limp back, riddled with holes from flak and fighter cannons, their crews exhausted and their airframes stressed to the breaking point. Replacement parts, especially specific, non-critical components, were becoming dangerously scarce. A palpable strain existed between the desperate need to maintain operational strength and the unyielding demand. Too lively for by-the-book repairs. The conflict came to a head late one night under the colossal wing of the B-24, nicknamed the Times Kansas Queen *. The air was cold and bit deep, and the only light came from a single portable work lamp that threw long, dancing shadows across the wet concrete. Earl was performing a final check after a major repair to the wing's internal structure. He ran his hand along a line of rivets, his touch as sensitive as a surgeon's, feeling for any looseness, any sign of stress. His fingers stopped on the head of a bolt securing a secondary spar access panel. It was the final load, bearing bolt for the panel, and as he put his wrench to it for a final torque check, he felt the sickening soft give of stripped threads. He carefully backed it out. In the harsh glare of the work lamp, the problem was clear. The T9 aluminum bolt, designed to be lightweight, was mangled, its fine threads shredded into useless metallic mush. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He knew what this meant. He hurried to the supply tent, the useless bolt feeling feather, light and fragile in his palm. The supply clerk, a weary corporal with tired eyes, barely glanced at it. "Stripped a T9 aluminum?" The clerk sighed, shaking his head. "Sorry, Haskins, we're fresh out. Got a shipment due next week, maybe. The whole 8th Air Force is screaming for them." "Next week?" Earl said, his voice low. "This bird flies at dawn." The clerk just shrugged, a gesture of helpless finality that was becoming all too common. Earl walked back to the silent bomber, his mind racing. He knew that without this bolt, the access panel wasn't secure. Under the immense stress of flight, the vibration and aerodynamic forces could work it loose. A loose panel on the surface of a wing could disrupt the airflow, causing drag, instability, or worse. It wasn't a primary structural component, the wing wouldn't fall off, but it was critical for holding the outer skin rigid and maintaining the wing's delicate aerodynamic integrity. The correct procedure was simple: ground the plane. Red, tag it as unfit for flight until the proper part arrived. But grounding the Times Kansas Queen Times meant one less bomber in tomorrow's crucial raid. It meant a gap in the formation, a weakness the German fighters would exploit. It meant the other crews would be that much more exposed. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. He pictured the flimsy, stripped aluminum bolt in his hand, and then, unbidden, the image of his father's strong, confident hands fixing the barn door surfaced in his mind. Asterisk. Something with more backbone than brains. Asterisk. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar, cold, heavy steel of the barn hinge screw. He pulled it out. In the lamplight, it looked brutish and out of place, a relic from another world. It was the wrong size, the wrong material, the wrong everything according to the book, but it was strong. Its threads were deep and coarse. Its steel body was thick and unyielding. It was everything the aluminum bolt was not. After a moment of intense, silent debate, a decision was made. The part of him that was a Kansas farm boy won out over the part that was a United States Army corporal. He fetched his tools. With a careful, methodical precision, he retapped the hole in the spar's frame, his movements economical and sure. He cleaned the new threads, then slowly, deliberately drove the heavy steel screw into place. It bit deep into the metal, turning with a satisfying, solid resistance. It fit perfectly. The ugly, dark, protruding head of the screw looked glaringly out of place against the silver aluminum of the wing, a defiant smudge on a clean page. It was non-standard, uncalibrated, and far too heavy. But Earl knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any regulation, that it would hold. He was wiping the grease from his hands on a rag when a sharp, incensed voice cut through the night. "What in God's name is that, Corporal?" Sergeant Wallace stood there, his arms crossed, his face a mask of disbelief that was quickly contorting into fury. His eyes, trained to spot any deviation from the norm, had immediately locked onto the dark, protruding head of the steel screw. "What is that?" Wallace repeated, his voice rising as he stepped closer, pointing a trembling finger. "Did you put a piece of farm equipment in a United States Army aircraft?" "The aluminum bolt was stripped, Sergeant," Earl said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "There were no replacements. This will hold it. It's stronger." "Stronger?" Wallace's voice was practically a shriek. "It's unauthorized. It's uncalibrated. It throws off the weight distribution. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've compromised this entire airframe with a piece of junk from your pocket." Wallace didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed Earl by the arm. "You're coming with me." He dragged Earl across the cold, wind-swept tarmac to the base commander's office. Major Croft, a stern, tired man with the weight of the air war etched into the lines on his face, was still at his desk. He listened, his expression growing darker as Sergeant Wallace delivered his irate, sputtering report, finishing by presenting the stripped aluminum bolt as if it were evidence in a murder trial. When Wallace was finished, a heavy silence filled the small office. Major Croft leaned back in his chair and fixed his gaze on Earl, a look of profound disappointment in his eyes. "Corporal," the major said, his voice low and dangerous, "your job is to follow the manual, not to re-engineer my bombers. Your job is to identify problems you can't fix and report them, not to improvise with junk from your pocket." "Sir, with respect," Earl began, but Croft cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "There is no respect in what you did, Haskins. You violated a dozen regulations and you put a crew at risk with an untested, unapproved modification. You are grounded, confined to quarters until I figure out what to do with you. Now get out of my sight." Earl felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than the English night. It wasn't just that he was in trouble. In the eyes of his commanders, he was a disgrace. He'd betrayed their trust. He gave the major a stiff salute, turned, and walked out of the office. The weight of their anger, and the uncertain fate of the Times Kansas Queen asterisk pressing down on him like the crushing depths of the ocean. The punishment began the next morning. It was a bleak, monotonous tour of the base's least desirable duties, a deliberate stripping of his identity as a skilled mechanic. The world of engines and airframes, once a source of immense pride and purpose, was now a distant country from which he had been exiled. He was assigned to the mess hall first, his hands, which knew the precise feel of a perfectly torqued bolt, now plunged into greasy dishwater and then tasked with peeling a mountain of potatoes. The rhythmic scrape of the peeler was a maddeningly simple sound compared to the complex symphony of a running Liberator engine. Later, he was sent to scrub the latrines, the harsh smell of disinfectant, a poor substitute for the familiar scent of aviation fuel. His final detail of the day was in the supply depot, sorting inventory. He spent hours sifting through bins of identical regulation, issue nuts, bolts, and washers, each one a silent accusation. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. Through it all, the roar of the engines was a constant, painful reminder of his fall from grace. He would hear a B-24 taxiing for a test run, and his head would snap up, his muscles tensing with the instinct to listen, to diagnose, to help. Then he would remember, and the sound would transform from a call to action into a chorus of judgment. He saw the other mechanics whispering as he passed, their eyes sliding away when he met their gaze. The story of his farm boy fix had spread like a virus through the barracks, a cautionary tale of what happened when you thought you knew better than the army. He replayed the confrontation with Major Croft and Sergeant Wallace in his mind, a continuous, looping film of his own disgrace. A hot flush of shame would rise in his cheeks as he remembered the Major's cold, disappointed eyes. The humiliation of being dressed down, of being treated like a fool, stung deeply. But beneath the shame, another feeling persisted, a stubborn, quiet conviction that was rooted in the Kansas soil of his memory. He couldn't shake the image of the flimsy, stripped aluminum bolt. It was a point of failure waiting to happen, a weakness designed by men who had never seen a thunderstorm. He found himself worrying, not for his tarnished career or the official reprimand that was surely coming, but for the 10 men who were scheduled to fly the Times Kansas Queen asterisk. The sharpest pang of his ostracism came in the form of Private Jansen. Jansen was a young mechanic, barely out of his teens, with a perpetual look of awe and 1,000 questions. He had attached himself to Earl, following him around the hangar, eager to absorb any scrap of knowledge. Earl had been patient with him, seeing a younger version of himself in the boy's enthusiasm. Now, as Earl walked from the supply depot towards the barracks, he saw Jansen approaching. For a moment, their eyes met, and Earl saw a flicker of the old admiration, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. Jansen's gaze dropped to his boots, and he abruptly changed direction, pretending to be intensely interested in a parked jeep. The subtle act of avoidance, the silent social shunning, hurt more than any official punishment could. It was a confirmation of his new status, an outcast among his own kind. The next morning, a light, persistent drizzle fell from the gray sky, coating everything in a slick, cold sheen. On the flight line, Lieutenant Davies, the pilot of the Times Kansas Queen Asterisk, conducted his pre-flight walk around. He was young for a man with so much responsibility, with a confidence set to his jaw that belied the quiet pragmatism in his eyes. He trusted his crew implicitly, both the men who flew with him and the men who kept his bird in the air. His movements were a familiar ritual, a conversation with the aircraft. He ran his bare hand over the aluminum skin, feeling the rivets, checking the seams, his touch both a question and a reassurance. As he came around the front of the right wing, his eyes caught something. He stopped. There, just behind the number 4 engine, was a dark, ugly blotch against the silver expanse of the wing. He leaned closer. It was the head of a screw, a thick, brutish, dark gray screw, where a flush, lightweight aluminum bolt was supposed to be. Sergeant Wallace, who was overseeing the flight prep with an air of nervous importance, materialized at his elbow. "It's a temporary, unauthorized repair, Lieutenant," Wallace said, his voice clipped and dismissive, as if discussing a piece of dirt, made by a mechanic who's been disciplined for it. "The engineers have looked at the report. They say it's within acceptable stress limits for this mission, but it will be removed and replaced the second we get a proper T9. Davies didn't respond immediately. He reached out and touched the head of the screw. It was cold and absolutely immovable. "Feels solid," he murmured, more to himself than to Wallace. He looked at the sergeant. "Who did it?" "Corporal Haskins, sir," Wallace said, the name spoken like an accusation. Davies's expression shifted from curiosity to thoughtful recollection. "Haskins," he said, his gaze drifting to the number 3 engine on the other wing. "He's the one who tweaked the fuel mixture on number 3. Gave me an extra 50 miles of range when we were running on fumes over the channel. He knows this bird." He looked back at the screw, then at Wallace's anxious face. A flicker of unease went through him, the ingrained respect for procedure warring with his own experience. The book said this was wrong, dangerous even, but his gut and his memory of Earl Haskins's uncanny skill told him a different story. He made a decision. He would trust his mechanic's judgment over Wallace's by-the-book panic. It was a small act of faith, a quiet vote of confidence that went unnoticed by anyone but himself, a crucial turning point that hung unseen in the damp morning air. "All right, Sergeant," Davies said, straightening up. "Let's get her ready to fly." Earl was not at the mission briefing. He was outside the Nissen hut that served as the briefing room, tasked with cleaning the mud-caked treads of a supply truck. The thin walls of the building did little to block the sound from within. He could hear the muffled, serious drone of Major Croft's voice, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. It was the sound of impending danger. The atmosphere around the hut was thick with a unique tension that preceded a major raid, a mixture of gallows humor, quiet contemplation, and palpable fear. He saw the flight crews file in, their young faces etched with a gravity that aged them beyond their years. Inside, a large, smoke-filled room was dominated by maps of Germany that covered the walls, red lines tracing a path deep into enemy territory. Earl leaned on his shovel, straining to hear. Snippets of the Major's voice cut through the wall, sharp and clear. "Heavily defended. Ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. Concentrations of anti-aircraft flak, some of the heaviest in Europe." Each word was a hammer blow to Earl's already frayed nerves. He could picture the scene inside, the anxious faces of the pilots and gunners, their eyes fixed on the red line that marked their path into hell. He heard the Major's voice rise in emphasis. "Tight formation is absolutely critical. Your survival depends on it. Mutual protection, every single bomber counts. Every single bomber." The phrase echoed in Earl's mind. His thoughts were entirely on the Times Kansas Queen Times and the single, ugly, steel bolt holding its wing together. The weight of his decision, made in the lonely hours of the previous night, settled on him with a crushing force. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, a connection to the fate of the 10 men in that plane, yet he was completely disconnected from any ability to act. He was a ghost at the feast, a silent participant in a drama he had set in motion but could no longer influence. His anxiety was a living thing, a cold, coiling serpent in his gut. He wasn't worried about his punishment anymore. He was terrified for them. The waiting was the hardest part. After the briefing broke, the base erupted into a final, frantic burst of activity. Fuel trucks moved into position, armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition, and the flight crews, now clad in their heavy, fleece-lined gear, made their way to their aircraft. The air began to vibrate, a low hum that grew into a ground, shaking roar as dozens of Wright Cyclone engines coughed to life, spewing blue smoke into the grey morning. The sound was deafening, a majestic, terrifying symphony of power that vibrated deep in Earl's bones. He found a spot near the edge of the field, partially hidden behind a stack of empty fuel drums. From there, he watched as the massive B-24 seconds thundered down the runway, one by one. They seemed impossibly heavy, clinging to the earth until the last possible second before lifting into the air with a ponderous, lumbering grace. He watched for the tail art of the Times, Kansas Queen asterisk, a jaunty, pin-up-style painting of a girl in a Dorothy costume. He saw it, third in its element, and his breath caught in his throat. The bomber roared past his position, the noise a physical blow. He couldn't see the bolt, of course, but he knew exactly where it was. A tiny, secret piece of a Kansas farm buried in the heart of a war machine. He tracked the plane as it climbed, joining the vast, circling formation that was assembling in the sky. A great, winged armada turning east towards the enemy. He watched until the Times Kansas, Queen Times, was just a speck, a dark cross against the clouds, before it disappeared completely. A profound, soul-crushing feeling of complete powerlessness washed over him. His fate, the pilot's fate, the crew's fate. It was all flying into enemy territory at 200 miles an hour. It all hinged on a single, greasy steel screw he had carried in his pocket since he was a boy. He sent a silent, desperate prayer with them, a wordless plea to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, a prayer for the strength of steel and the wisdom of a long, dead farmer. Then, the last bomber was gone, and a strange, unnatural silence descended upon the airfield. The roar was replaced by the whisper of the wind and the distant shouts of the remaining ground crew. The waiting began. For Earl, it was the hardest part of his life. The next several hours passed in a state of suspended animation. He was relieved of his punishment detail, but he couldn't work. He couldn't rest. He couldn't eat. He just waited, his eyes fixed on the eastern sky, listening for the sound of returning engines. Time itself seemed to slow down, each minute stretching into an eternity, each tick of the clock a small, sharp torture. His entire world had shrunk to this single point of agonizing suspense. The sky over Schweinfurt was a garden of black flowers, each one blooming with a heart of fire and steel. Inside the Times Kansas Queen asterisk, the noise was a physical thing, a monster made of sound that tried to tear the plane apart. The constant, deafening roar of their own 4 engines was overlaid with the frantic rattle of the waste guns and the percussive, gut-churning Times whump, whump, whump times of flak shells exploding nearby. The entire 200,000-pound bomber bucked and shook, a beast in its death throes. The bombardier's voice, miraculously calm, cut through the chaos on the intercom. "Bombs away!" The plane lurched violently upwards, suddenly lighter by thousands of pounds, a momentary feeling of relief that was instantly shattered. A flak shell exploded directly below the right wing. It wasn't a distant concussion. It was an intimate, personal blow, a giant's fist slamming up into the airframe. The world became a scream of tearing metal and the high, piercing shriek of an alarm bell. "We're hit. Flak, right wing. It's coming apart." "The co-pilot yelled, his voice tight with a panic that threatened to consume them all. From the waist, another voice, young and terrified, confirmed the horror. "I can see it. The skin is gone. The whole wing is shredding." Lieutenant Davies fought the controls, the yoke trying to tear itself from his hands as the plane tried to roll over onto its back. Through the maelstrom, his voice was a lifeline of calm authority. "Is the spar intact? Talk to me. What do you see?" There was a pause, a beat of stunned silence on the intercom, and then the waist gunner's voice came back, laced with disbelief. It's holding. The main joint is holding. I don't know how, sir, but it's holding." Through the shattered plexiglass of his cockpit window, Davies saw another B-24 from their group, the Times Lucky Lady asterisk, take a similar hit. He watched in detached horror as its right wing, struck in almost the exact same place, simply gave up. It folded upwards like a closing book, and the bomber, its flight dynamics destroyed in an instant, began a slow, graceful, and utterly horrifying spiral towards the earth, trailing a thick plume of black smoke and fire. Davies realized with a sickening certainty that the same thing should be happening to them. The physics of flight and combat damage demanded it, but it wasn't. That one, single, solitary point of connection, that ugly, non-regulation, farm boy fix, was refusing to break. It was a stubborn anchor of Kansas steel in a storm of German destruction, and it was the only thing keeping them in the sky. The journey back was an agonizingly slow crawl across an endless, hostile sky. The Times, Kansas Queen Times, had fallen out of the protective embrace of the formation, a wounded beast left behind by the herd. It flew low and sluggishly, the wind whistling a mournful, shrieking tune through the skeletal remains of its right wing. The adrenaline of combat faded, replaced by a grim, grinding struggle for survival. The crew, now silent and focused, worked with a desperate efficiency. On Davies's orders, they jettisoned everything they could to save weight. Heavy ammunition boxes were shoved out the open waist gunner positions, followed by flak vests, spare parts, and finally, the heavy .50 caliber machine guns themselves. Each item cast out was a small sacrifice, a prayer for a few more feet of altitude, a few more seconds of flight time. For hours, Davies and his co-pilot wrestled with the controls, their muscles burning with a deep, trembling ache, sweat stinging their eyes. The plane was a disobedient mule, constantly trying to dip its mangled wing and pull them into a final, fatal dive. As he flew, his body locked in a battle with his own aircraft, Davies's mind kept returning to the pre-flight check. He saw the damp English morning, felt the cold drizzle on his face. He saw the odd dark screw head, so out of place against the silver aluminum. He heard Sergeant Wallace's clipped, dismissive tone, calling it an unauthorized mistake. He remembered the quiet mechanic, Haskins, the kid who had somehow tweaked the fuel mixture on No. 3 engine and given them an extra 50 miles of range when they were running on fumes over the channel. The pieces began to click into place in his exhausted mind, forming a picture that was as unbelievable as it was undeniable. The screw wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a sloppy, ignorant repair. It was insurance. It was a piece of over-engineered, farm boy logic. A stubborn refusal to accept failure that had just saved all their lives. Back at the airbase, hours had passed. The first of the bombers had returned, many of them showing the scars of the mission, but they had returned. For Earl, the waiting had become a physical torture. His stomach was a tight, cold knot of dread. He stood at the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on the empty eastern sky, listening. Then he heard it. It wasn't the confident, synchronized roar of returning engines. It was a lone, sputtering, uneven cough, the sound of a machine in profound pain. A single speck appeared on the horizon, growing agonizingly slowly. As it drew closer, Earl could see its shape was wrong. It was flying dangerously low, and one wing looked like a skeleton, a mangled wreck of torn metal and gaping holes. His heart stopped. Through the haze, he could just make out the tail art, the jaunty girl in the Dorothy costume. It was the Times Kansas Queen asterisk. He was frozen to the spot, unable to breathe, unable to think. The landing was a masterclass in aviation, a testament to the skill and courage of its pilot. Davies brought the crippled giant in, coaxing it towards the runway with an almost gentle touch. It touched down with a prolonged groan of protesting metal and a scream of tortured rubber. Emergency crews, fire trucks and ambulances were already racing towards it before it had even rolled to a stop. A crowd began to gather, ground crew and off-duty pilots drawn by the spectacle of the near-dead returning home. As the bomber slowed to a halt, the full, horrific extent of the damage became visible to everyone. The right wing was almost completely peeled open, the aluminum skin shredded and torn away, exposing the internal spars and ribs. It looked like the carcass of a great metal bird picked clean by vultures. And there, in the very center of the wreckage, at the critical junction where the main spar met a secondary frame member, was the source of the miracle. The dark, greasy head of the steel barn screw sat placidly in its new home. It was surrounded by a halo of twisted, torn, and shredded aluminum, but the screw itself was pristine, unscratched, its heavy, unyielding shoulders having borne a load they were never designed for, a load that had sent another bomber and 10 men spiraling to their doom. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Sergeant Wallace pushed his way to the front, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. He walked forward as if in a trance, reached out a trembling hand, and touched the head of the screw. He then looked over the crowd, his eyes searching, and found Earl, who was standing alone, a ghost on the edge of the assembly. The sergeant's face was a complex, unreadable canvas of disbelief, awe, and a profound, world-altering humility. Major Croft was there too, his face a grim mask. Just then, Lieutenant Davies, his face stained with grease and exhaustion, climbed slowly down from the cockpit. He ignored the medics rushing towards him and walked straight to the Major. "Whatever that is, Major," he said, his voice raspy and low, pointing a shaky finger at the screw. "It's the only reason we're alive." The plane that was next to us, the Times Lucky Lady Asterisk, took the same hit, their wing folded in half. We saw them go down. Major Croft stared at the screw, then at the shredded wing, then his eyes scanned the crowd and finally locked onto Earl. A flicker of understanding, of dawning realization, crossed the Major's tired face. He turned to a nearby officer. "Get me the lead engineer from right field on the line. Tell them we have something they need to see." He then looked directly at Sergeant Wallace. "And find Corporal Haskins," he said, his voice carrying a new and unfamiliar tone of respect. "I need to have a word with him." A few days later, Earl stood in Major Croft's office for the second time. The atmosphere, however, could not have been more different. The air of tension and disappointment was gone, replaced by a quiet, palpable sense of respect. Earl stood before the Major's desk, but this time he was not a disgrace, not a pariah. He was the man of the hour. Major Croft was there, and next to him sat a distinguished older man in a civilian suit, his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied a technical report. He was the lead engineer from right field, flown in to investigate the miracle of the Times Kansas Queen Asterisk. The engineer finally looked up, his sharp, intelligent eyes fixing on Earl not with condemnation, but with a kind of academic curiosity. "Corporal," the engineer began, his voice calm and analytical, "what you did was against every regulation in the book. It was unorthodox, undocumented, and by all rights should have earned you a court-martial." He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the small office. "It was also brilliant." He tapped the report with his finger. "The standard T9 aluminum bolt is designed primarily for tensile strength. Its job is to hold the access panel on. It has a very low shear strength. When that flak shell detonated, the shockwave created a massive shearing force that propagated across the wing frame. On the other aircraft, the standard issue bolts sheared off clean in a fraction of a second. Once they failed, the aerodynamic forces did the rest, and the wing collapsed." The engineer leaned forward, his eyes alight with intellectual excitement. "Your steel screw, with its deep, coarse threading and vastly superior material strength, was effectively immune to that shearing force. It held the load, transferring the violent energy across the main spar without failing. It acted as a structural failsafe, a point of ultimate strength that the original designers, in their quest for lightness, never even conceived of." Major Croft took over, his voice filled with a gravity that Earl had never heard from him before. "The Army Air Force is officially adopting your field modification, Corporal. We're issuing a technical directive to reinforce critical wing joints on all B, 24 seconds, and B, 17 seconds with high-strength steel bolts. They're calling it the Haskins pin." The Major leaned forward, his eyes locking with Earl's. "You saved 10 men on that plane, son, and your idea," he said, his voice softening slightly, "is probably going to save hundreds more before this war is over." Earl was speechless, overwhelmed. The cold shame that had been his constant companion for days was washed away by a warm, rising tide of profound vindication. In a short formal ceremony the next day, he was awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service. His punishment was officially and permanently expunged from his record, and he was promoted to the rank of sergeant on the spot. But more than the medal, more than the new stripes on his sleeve, he felt the quiet, powerful satisfaction of his father's practical, farm-bred knowledge being validated on the world stage. Decades passed. The world changed. The 1990s found the same Kansas farm bathed in the same golden, late afternoon sun. The air was peaceful, smelling of rich soil and the sweet scent of hay, just as it always had. An elderly Earl Haskins sat on his porch swing, the rhythmic creak of the chains a familiar, comforting sound. He was an old man now, his hands weathered and spotted with age, but they were still the strong, capable hands of a man who understood machines. He reached into his pocket, a familiar, lifelong habit, and his fingers closed around a familiar object. He pulled it out and rolled it in his palm. It was a heavy, dark gray steel screw, its finish worn smooth from a lifetime of being carried, identical to the one that had saved the Times Kansas Queen Asterisk. He didn't think about the medal, which sat in a dusty box in a closet somewhere, or the promotion, a distant memory of a younger man's life. He thought about the feel of the B-24's cold aluminum skin under his hands in the damp English night. He thought about the acrid smell of aviation fuel and cordite that had filled his nostrils for years. He thought of the terrified, crackling voice of the co-pilot on the intercom, a voice he had never met but would never forget. He thought of his father, a man of few words and deep wisdom, and the simple, powerful lesson taught on a sun-drenched summer afternoon so long ago. It wasn't about being right according to a book, but about doing what was right for the job, with the materials you had. It was a lesson in having more backbone than brains, a lesson that, for one terrifying day over the heart of enemy territory, had held the sky up. A quiet, knowing smile touched his lips as he looked at the bolt in his hand, a silent testament to a simple truth learned in the dirt and proven, beyond all doubt, in the clouds.